Welcome to the St. John Vianney Center's podcast series, Journey to Thrive. In this podcast, Dr. Don Marks addresses the topic of boundaries. Let's listen as he explores the psychological significance of boundaries, their importance to human relationships, and approaches to healing and restoration.
The title of my talk for you today is Boundaries and Differentiation. What keeps us together is what sets us apart. And I'll get into a little bit of what I mean by that as we go. My plan for what it is we're going to talk about are some of the interpersonal and cooperative dimensions of human beings, boundaries and perspectives, which I think are related in ways that we might not always think about. Also, I'm going to talk about differentiation, the differentiation of persons, and the importance of I-thou relating. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Martin Buber will recognize that I-thou form of relating. And then I'll also talk about problems related to boundary violations, perhaps in many cases stemming from self-focused attention, and then ways of responding with healing and compassion and strategies for preventing boundary problems. And I want to just begin by acknowledging, if you will, the kind of beings we are. A great quote from Martin Buber, who I'm going to talk about a few times today, all real living is meeting. And so there's something relational about living as a human person. And there is a way in which being human is a fundamentally interpersonal kind of being. There really is no I without we. And perhaps you've encountered the Ubuntu philosophy statement, I am because we are. So this is something that is essential in who we are and in our identity that actually arises out of relationship. And this openness to others is a foundational human characteristic. I have a quote here from Pope Benedict. We are the image of God precisely because we are relational creatures, created to find true life in receiving and giving. There is, at an essential level, a relational quality to the human person. And another, this is a conclusion that many social scientists have drawn over the years. Another fascinating characteristic of what it is to be human is to be cooperative. We are foundationally cooperative beings. And everything that we do, our very survival, is predicated on this cooperative nature that we have. But this leads to boundary problems. There is this sense when we cooperate with other people that we have to kind of navigate what is mine and what is yours. And even at a more fundamental level, where do I end and you begin? Differentiation becomes a very crucial part of something as fundamental as cooperating. And it's funny, we think about how troubled our times are and how difficult so many political and interpersonal situations can be. But nevertheless, there is still something that is remarkably cooperative, even about our disagreements, as more than one sociologist has observed. Human beings even have to cooperate at a very high level to fight wars with each other. There is something that is intrinsically cooperative about us, and it does raise some of these boundary questions. One of the aspects of our cooperation has to do with the way that we protect each other. And meerkats have this interesting practice that when the group is together, most of the meerkats in the group play with each other, while a few stand as sentinels to watch for predators or other threats. Each of these standing meerkats is looking in a different direction. And I think this highlights some of the importance of the necessity for different perspectives. And we see this in all kinds of aspects of human culture. The importance of having another perspective can't really be overstated. It is absolutely crucial that we have it. And we could think about, even in our tradition, the importance of having the four Gospels, four different perspectives. There's something that is deeply important about having multiple points of view. Now this relates to things in a boundary way, in the sense that multiple points of view get a little bit complicated. It's not like we're going to say that, okay, we've got an easy way of knowing which point of view is the most important one, because we don't necessarily have that. This is really where boundaries begin. That boundaries arise in human relationships because human beings become who they are in relationships, and there needs to be some kind of agency, some kind of individual action in order for cooperation to take place. There has to be some way of navigating the differences that this requires. And I'm going to highlight this today. I'm going to talk about the role that dialogue plays. It's really relational dialogue that allows us to navigate the differences which are necessary for our cooperation and those safety providing points of view. In this sense, we might say, as I tried to say in the title of the talk, boundaries, which are what set us apart, are actually what bring us together. They actually allow us to come together. And communication without negotiated boundaries is often experienced as quite aggressive and threatening, intimidating, overwhelming, and the like. One of the things that I think we've begun to realize, and it's really only in recent years that people have begun to recognize this, is that the way that we communicate through digital media lacks the opportunity for the dialogical relationship that allows people to navigate boundaries and differences. And so much of the information that people consume through digital media is actually experienced as highly anxiety-provoking and actually quite alienating. There's a new book about this by Nicholas Carr. I recommend to you. It's called Super Bloom: How Technologies of Connection Are Tearing Us Apart. And you can see this problem of not having a dialogical way of relating in those sort of digital media. This process of differentiation and developing a unique point of view actually goes to the core of human development. And I want to take us for a little, it's like a slight tangent here, but I want to take us on a little tangent into some aspects of family development. For people to develop their own point of view in the context of relationships, there has to be some place where that can happen. And the family really is a key place where it does happen as we're growing up. One of my favorite family therapists, who I'm going to talk about for a little bit here, is Murray Bowen. Some of you may be familiar with his work. He's a very prominent family systems therapist. And what Bowen said is that this differentiation, developing one's own point of view, was actually a kind of capacity that we might think about as flexibility or maturity, that a person would be able to respond to internal and external pressures, to changes in situations, and to think reflectively about them from their own point of view without being completely knocked off kilter. That we could think of as differentiation. And the family is the place where that emerges. You can see this in the family, where each person in the family has a first name and a family name. There's a way that the family is a kind of dialectic of togetherness and individuality. And that tension is an important tension that allows for the development of unique points of view or differentiation. What Bowen said was that families exerted different kinds of pressure on their members. And one of the things that would happen in some families is that the pressure would be very great to differentiate, whereas in other families it might be just the opposite. The pressure might be such that it was very difficult for people to have their own point of view. Bowen also noted that when families are stressed, and they're in difficult environments, maybe caused by war, by famine, by economic hardship, any number of social crises that might contribute to this. When families are stressed, people tend to be more emotionally reactive, And they also tend to be uncomfortable with differentiation. Developing a unique perspective within that family is much more difficult because it heightens anxiety in the family. Some of these issues, which these might seem a little arcane relative to boundary violations, I think we're going to see they actually pertain directly to how problems with boundaries come about. One of the things that Bowen noticed in his research on families was that when families did have anxiety about differentiation, and two people in the family, maybe it's the parents or maybe it's another dyad within the family, when they have difficulty resolving anxiety about emerging points of view, they triangulate. And what they do is they incorporate a third party to reduce the anxiety. And Bowen called this move, which was a shift toward a kind of togetherness, but it was a togetherness that served the purpose of reducing anxiety. He called this fusion. And in fusion, there was a kind of a low degree of autonomy, relatively little in the way of unique points of view, and what he called a pseudo-intimacy. And then sometimes this anxiety would also push people toward a kind of false individuality. And in that case, even though it would seem like people were actually separate with their own point of view, they were actually emotionally cut off and unable to engage in dialogue with members of their family. And so they would achieve a kind of independence that really wasn't negotiated through differentiation. He called it a pseudo-independence. You see this in families quite often, where there's one person who is cut off from the family, not really talking to other people in the family, and there doesn't seem to be much potential for a dialogical development in that case. What Bowen was identifying here were some of the conditions in which our basic sense of ourselves as differentiated from others and having our own point of view developed. And as I mentioned before, circumstances where there are high levels of social stress make it much harder for this differentiation to happen because it becomes more anxiety provoking in those circumstances. I want to suggest to you that what Bowen is calling differentiated relating is actually I and thou relating. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it is a genuine dialogue between two different perspectives. And those of you who might be familiar with Martin Buber will know that he made a distinction between what he called I-thou relating and I-it relating. In I-it relating, the other person is objectified in some way. It's not a dialogue. It's a relation to a person as an object, more or less. And what I want to suggest is that the I-it relationship is in effect a boundary violation. And it is one because it lacks this dialogical respect for the different point of view. And in that sense, it actually lacks relating. A profound respect for the other is required to have a dialogical relationship. And in those relationships that we would call I-thou relationships, our presence to each other matters more than any procedure. Procedure in these cases, etiquette, things like that, who talks next, all those kinds of issues, those are important, but they're understood really as a way of protecting presence. If my argument is holding any water here, you'll hear what I'm saying is that differentiation, developing one's own unique point of view, is actually required for the I-thou relationship. And it's a kind of two-way street that responsibility to the other is the other dimension of it. I have my own point of view, and I have a responsibility to appreciate your or respect your point of view. I can't, in doing that, reduce the other person to an object or engage in I-it relating. It's not an instrumental relationship. I do want to suggest, and I believe this to be true, that the I-it relationship is intrinsically a boundary violation. And that is what I want to shift to here and talk a little bit about what we mean by this. What constitutes a boundary violation when we use this term in relationships? First thing I want to say is that not all boundary crossings constitute violations. Sometimes we might be very generous with our time to another person or with our attention to another person, and we might say that, we're kind of, if you will, creating a kind of specialness in a relationship in a circumstance like that. Now, that could be problematic in some cases, but it isn't necessarily so. It could be a crossing of expected procedures and boundaries, but not necessarily a violation. The setting and the function of the behavior typically define when a boundary crossing is problematic. Now, what I want to suggest is that the subordination of the other and the interests and perspectives of the other to one's own ends is what typically characterizes a boundary violation. And it's this disregard for the other that relinquishes respect and presence that are required for a dialogical relationship. To reiterate here, the seeds of boundary violations or I-it relating begin in objectification, and I want to suggest that they especially begin with self-objectification. Some of you may be familiar with the philosophical school of personalism. Personalism views the human person as a radical capacity for relatedness and also understands that human beings are different from things. We're different kinds of beings from things. When we end up treating one another as things is when we get into this particular trouble of disregarding the other person's perspective. There's also a way that it's intrinsically false when we do this, that, human beings, human persons are metaphysically irreducible and mysterious, and in ways that make categorical objectification impossible, unless you are actually degrading the being of the person. There is also a kind of falseness around these objective or instrumental ways of relating. And then the other thing I would say is that the I-it relationship fundamentally is constituted by a lapse in empathy where human beings become means to ends. Why does this happen? And why might it be happening now to the degree that it is happening? I think it's kind of helpful to think a little bit about the way that we have in our era, especially heightened engagement in social comparison and commodified the self. One of my favorite sociologists, actually like a early 20th century sociologist, Charles Horton Cooley, he talked about what he called the looking glass self. And he what he meant by that is the way that people are comparing themselves to others such that they're trying to discern what others think about them or how others evaluate them. And Cooley famously said, "I am not what I think I am. I am not what you think I am. I am what I think you think I am." There's this process of self-objectification and social comparison in which we're engaging now, perhaps to a higher degree than at any other time in history. And a couple of different people have written extensively about this. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han has talked about it and talked about forms of auto-exploitation in which people are engaged, so that in our society there's a tendency to treat ourselves, we treat ourselves as objects, and we treat ourselves as means to ends. It's very likely that we'll do this with others too. And another philosopher who has written, I think, beautifully about this is Anton Barbaquet. He has a book called A Web of Our Own Making, The Nature of Digital Formation. And I think he gets too at the ways in which we might be treating ourselves in this objective way. One of the problems that we have is that we're living in a culture that really prioritizes social comparison and evaluation, both of which are forms of objectification. And this leads people to be kind of continually checking their own stock value. We're constantly trying to see, how do we stack up? And we're trying to engage in instrumental efforts to justify ourselves and to somehow counter stories that we might be even telling ourselves, although other people might also be telling us these stories, that we're a bad object, that somehow we're a less than object, that there might be something that's defective or wrong with us. Shame narratives play a part in this. And that this way of looking at the self in a constant evaluative framework actually promotes uncertainty. It promotes a need for approval. It promotes heightened anxiety, and it then ends up promoting the instrumental use of others. We could look at this from a psychological perspective. I want to highlight a couple of things here. This is from the work of Paul Gilbert, British psychologist Paul Gilbert. He talks about these three functional dimensions of the human person, and I want to talk about these relative to the risk of objectification. What Gilbert says is that we have three different fundamental characteristics or ways of functioning, if you will. He says we acquire resources. We have an incentive resource focused. We might think of that as an appetitive way of relating with the world. It's very activating, wanting, pursuing, achieving, consuming. He says we also have a safety seeking, threat detection, and safety seeking way of interacting with the world, which is trying to avoid being harmed by others, trying to keep ourselves safe. And he points out that both of these ways of relating, what he calls the acquisitive way of relating and what he calls the safety-seeking way of relating, or the threat-focused way of relating, these dominate in our current culture. And he contrasts them to what he considers to be compassionate relating. And this is actually more like an I-thou relationship, where it's not wanting, it's affiliative. People coming together to collaborate with respect for each other's points of view. It's characterized by kindness. These relationships tend to be soothing. These are I-thou relationships. There's a way that we can see from a psychological perspective, too, that the emphasis that we've placed on material success and its protection has actually led us away from the I-thou relationship, but it's also facilitated a lot of objectifying of ourselves and others that leads to boundary violations. One of the consequences of this objectification and disconnection is a kind of vicious cycle. If I'm judging myself continually and comparing myself to others continually, I actually get very few opportunities for that rich, supportive, rewarding I-thou relationship. I'm actually on the defensive a great deal of the time, trying to protect myself from other people potentially treating me as an object. And life becomes sort of more competitive and more combative than supportive. What happens there is people lose opportunities for reward from their environment, and life becomes rather bleak. People feel depleted. Life doesn't feel like a gift. Life feels like a chore. And that leads people to withdraw from social relationships, lose interest, and then that further decreases their estimate of self-worth. People then become quite harsh in their self-criticisms, and you can see how this becomes a vicious cycle. Now, if I'm criticizing myself when I'm engaging in that social comparison, I'm evaluating myself even more negatively, pulling back more, losing the opportunity for those I-thou relationships. And I'm kind of now set up so that I'm likely to overstep boundaries because I'm in a more desperate position. And also, I'm more likely to relate to myself in ways that might lead others to treat me in an instrumental way. These are very problematic consequences of this culture of social comparison that we're in. The other thing here that happens is anger, and I want to talk about this for a moment because many times when people come to SJVC and they tell me, "Why are you here?" Well, I for a boundary violation. Oftentimes because they kind of exploded or yelled at somebody, in a way that was disrespectful, and it's easy for us to see that and look at that behavior and judge it. And I think it makes sense to be critical of that behavior. But it's also important that we look at what its sources might be. And I think one of the things that we fail to recognize is the relationship between anger and anxiety and how that contributes to boundary problems. Most anger is a response to threat or anxiety. We have this, we talk about that threat detection system as the fight or flight system, and anger is kind of the fight side of it. There's often a fear of rejection, a fear of disrespect, a fear of abuse or exploitation or abandonment that motivates people to engage in this anger. And because of their desperation and their fear, they will respond to other people in that objectifying I-it way. And their efforts to overcome or escape anger, to get out of the unpleasant, less than feeling that they have, can lead to temper outbursts, to name calling, and even physical interactions that violate boundaries. Fears of rejection, fears of evaluation by others, that can lead to insecurity, and then boundary crossings and violations actually are attempts to seek safety from that insecurity. It's important for us to recognize that these behaviors that are highly problematic, they come from a position of fear and a negative self-evaluation and misery. And that we might be able to respond to them a little differently if we recognize that. These problems occur in different ways. I often talk about these two forms of relating, problematic or boundary violating relating, that happen in the absence of compassion, or we might say in the absence of the I-thou relationship. And two terms for this are vertical violence, which is when there's been a rupture in a service relationship, a hierarchical relationship, and then also there can be horizontal hostility, and that's a rupture in a collegial relationship. Boundary violations can kind of occur in either of those directions, and the objectification can happen in either of those directions. A compassionate, relationship-centered approach to conflict and disagreements, different points of view, actually can help us maintain relationships so that we don't lapse into these patterns of vertical violence or horizontal hostility. One of the ways that this shows up in our culture all the time is in some of the more degrading aspects of debate. We don't often think about this, but a lot of our interactions with each other are predicated on a competitive way of relating. And there's I think, a nice distinction to be made between debate and dialogue. In a debate, the goal is to win. One person is better than the other in the sense that their position is better than the other, rather than attempting to find ways to understand the other person's position. In debate, the effort is to find ways to invalidate the other person's position, to oppose the other person as being wrong. And if you watch much in the way of television news, you'll see very quickly that one of the ways people use strong emotions in debate is to intimidate the other person. This is very different from the I-thou relationship, which is dialogical, where the goal is to understand the other person, to understand how their experiences could lead to their point of view, to accept the other person's point of view as real and valid, to understand what their experience has been like to the extent that you can, and to collaborate. And emotions still occur in a dialogical framework, but the way that they're used in that case is to convey the intensity of a belief or an experience, not to instrumentally intimidate the other. You can see how debate sets us up for what things that we might call boundary violations in ways that dialogue does not. What do we do in response to this? I like to talk about the compassionate alternative to boundary problems. And I want to specifically talk about the healing that happens through the reestablishment of agapeic community today. You can see from those functional dimensions of the human person that I talked about earlier, what I'm interested in here is what Gilbert calls the affiliative dimension of the person, and I'm saying that that's characterized by I-thou relating. I think where that begins, and I'm going to share with you some basic points of view from some of the more influential psychologists of the 20th century here. I think where that begins is in an appreciation for the dignity of the human person and heeding the call of the other. One of my favorite thinkers is Emmanuel Levinas, and Levinas says that our humanity begins in our recognition of our obligation to the other. And a very good book that I've been reading by Randall Smith called From Here to Eternity, and it's not that novel, From Here to Eternity, it's called From Here to Eternity. He says, I am called to render unto others the love that has been given to me. There's this way that we start from a position of having received a gift, rather than from this one down objectifying position, and then we're able to give that gift to others. And now many psychologists have talked about this. I mean, I guess we might question, why am I listening to another psychologist talk about this? Because so many great psychologists have talked about it, and we haven't necessarily got ourselves out of the problem. But some of you will recall Erich Fromm, who wrote a book called The Art of Loving. It's a very famous work. And he talked about agape love, this giving of oneself for the good of the other, is the only means of arriving at meaning in life. That was the path to meaning in life. Viktor Frankl wrote his beautiful book, Man's Search for Meaning, and it's clear that he sees agape as a necessary condition for surviving adversity in life. It's not going to be possible to get through the more difficult and painful aspects of life without this agape perspective. And then the great Carl Rogers, he saw unconditional positive regard, which is the concept that he's probably most famous for. He saw that unconditional positive regard for the other as the active component of any therapeutic healing. My friend Brent Dean Robbins, who teaches at Point Park University in Pittsburgh, he talks about these approaches as a hermeneutic of love, and he opposes that to a hermeneutic of suspicion. These objectifying perspectives that are trying to calculate our value relative to others, or the hierarchical value of a relationship. Those perspectives, which treat the human person as a thing, they are characterized by suspicion, whereas the hermeneutic of love is prioritizing the dignity of each individual person. We might also recognize here that the only way these possibilities are going to be able to thrive or to unfold is if we have some priority that we can place on forgiveness and restoration of affiliation if relational boundaries have been violated. There has to be some way that when a boundary violation occurs, a person feels like they've been hurt or objectified, they have to have a path for forgiveness and restoration of affiliation, so that the dignity of the other can once again be revealed. And there is this sort of, it's probably obvious, but there is this way that when I am objectified, the person who has objectified me, they are also objectified. And there's an important way to recognize that when we allow a person to violate boundaries, to treat us as an object, we're actually doing them harm, because it's also objectifying. They're also objectifying themselves in that circumstance. We really need these social processes, or these social priorities that can allow the dignity of one another, both parties, if you will, to be revealed again. And forgiveness is a foundational process for that. How do we respond compassionately? How do we respond in keeping with agape love when there have been boundary problems? One of the ways we do this is to acknowledge the problem and the consequences for all involved. There's no way that anybody can witness this or participate in it without there being consequences for them. And it's important that as a community, when something like this happens, we acknowledge that. We also have to be willing to recognize and appreciate statements of regret and responsibility, so that a person is actually permitted to regret their behavior and to take responsibility for it. I don't know what your experience with this has been. but I've seen this in a number of situations, from families to businesses to other organizations, where a person is expected to state that they take responsibility and to express regret, but that's it. And there's no actual forgiveness, just a continual reminder of the need to express regret. Just like these things can break if people artificially express regret, they can also break if statements of regret are not acknowledged and validated and allowed to do what statements of regret and requests for forgiveness are meant to do. It's also very important in these circumstances that the fear that is underneath the anger of the parties involved be articulated. And there has to be a time to reflect on the threat-related dimensions of the problem. Boundary violations don't happen outside the context of threat. There has to be something. It might not be readily apparent, but it can be identified through reflection, and there has to be time taken for that. There also has to be, and I think it's probably obvious to you, but it needs to be said, that the behavior that has been a boundary violation has to stop. There has to be some way of preventing the ongoing engagement in the toxic behavior. It's also important, this is sort of a corollary to what I was saying before about the importance of acknowledging regret. We also want to avoid shaming. The problem with shaming a person for their boundary violating behavior is that it makes it much more likely that it's going to occur again, because the person is being objectified, and there is a kind of violent relationship in shaming another person. And then it's important that we can remain present with aversive emotions, and we can stay with the experience that has been painful. And staying with an experience that's painful or a difficult emotion is actually, for most people, found to be a transformative experience. Sounds terrible. Sounds like, oh, why would I want to stay with that anger that I'm feeling? Why would I want to stay with that fear? Right? Sounds terrible. But most people will say, when they stay with it, reflect upon it, dialogue about it, that it's actually a transformative experience to respond that way, rather than to respond in the avoidant way that we typically do. And then I just want to put a plug in here. Again, these might be obvious things, but I think they're important to keep in mind. We don't necessarily want to be reactive in response to these problems. It's useful to kind of disentangle from sticky thoughts, emotionally charged thoughts, and these often are judgments. So judgments that the person is terrible, or that the person is an ogre, or whatever it might be. There's a lot of judgments that come up, and it's important to kind of disentangle from them. I like to say it's good to cultivate Teflon mind, so when the sticky thoughts come, they can kind of slide right off. And then the other thing that's important to recognize, especially if you're experiencing fear or sorrow or anger, difficult emotions, is that you're always larger than any experience of emotion that you have. There's an infinite spaciousness to each human person, always larger than any emotion you might have. There's always more to you. And that emotion, in a very important way, in that sense, can't fully overwhelm you. We get a little bit of freedom, if you will, if we recognize that. These emotions don't have to control us so much, because it's possible for us to make room for them. Those are just some compassionate responses to boundary problems. I think the key, though, and I want to highlight this, these are my last points for the day here, but I want to highlight this, that restoring the I-thou relationship is the key to preventing future boundary problems, and also to healing those that have occurred. And there's something characteristic about the I-thou that I haven't really talked about fully yet, and that is that it's a relationship that is both free and obliged. And it's a weird thing to say, but there's a way that this is true. Of course, when one person relates to another, that person is always free to stop relating. There is a freedom in the I-thou, and the other person is also free to stop relating. And then there is, at the same time, two seemingly contradictory things true at the same time here. There's a way that I'm obliged to care for the other person as well. This I-thou relationship has a very unique characteristic of being both free and obliged. How do we create relationships like that? And how do we create the condition for those kinds of relationships? I like the work of Diana Baumrind, who was actually a developmental psychologist who is an expert on parenting. And what Baumrind said was that the most effective form of parenting, she called it authoritative parenting. She said it was high in structure and high in warmth. And high structure, high warmth environments and leadership that's high in structure and warmth can actually facilitate healthy boundaries. If you just have high structure alone, so you have a kind of emphasis on structure, on obedience, but it doesn't have warmth and empathy and support in it, that tends to produce defensiveness and brittle boundaries. People who engage in blaming and also like competition and infighting kinds of things. If you just have high warmth without the structure or the expectations, people actually get quite anxious because the limits aren't clear and relationships and activities tend to drift. You often get perceptions of favoritism and you have a sense that no one is leading. We need this warmth and structure together. And Baumrind said that what the authoritative parent would say is, here's what we do and here's why we do it. Warmth and structure together conveys that. It provides clear boundaries and it provides a rationale for the boundaries. And then differentiation and dialogue become possible through the warmth and structure. It's safe for me to have my own point of view and to share my point of view. And I don't have to do any of those desperate things that might lead to objectifying another person in order to have my point of view. In this way, our relationships give rise to both freedom and obligation. We always have a choice, and we can, at the same time we have that choice, we can hear the call of the other. It's interesting because that relationship is actually what a boundary is. And when we have boundaries, that's what makes that kind of relationship possible. And if we have I-thou relating, we can have I-thou relating. Just some things that might help people develop empathy, forgiveness, and forbearance. Some things that might help us as we try to create the conditions for high structure and high warmth. One thing that's a really good idea is to check in often with people and see how they're feeling, and make sure that people feel welcome to participate in community. How are they hearing the call to give of themselves, right? That's a question I think we need to ask about people. In the doctoral program where I'm the director of training, I'm continually trying to check in, and my colleagues are too, to check in with the students. And one of the things we want to know about them, of course, we want to know how they're doing and, all those basic sorts of human things. But we want to know that they know that they're welcome to participate, right? And that there is something of a call in the community, an expectation, if you will, that they're going to give of themselves. Another thing that we can do is that we can respond to anger with compassion. So when we meet anger, we can remember that it's suffering, and we can create alternative opportunities for warm rather than heated interactions. In the absence of warm interactions, heated interactions are almost sure to arise. This is one I struggle with, but it's an important one. It's important to be quiet, to be heard. Mindful listening really facilitates dialogue. Listening is key. If you look around in the community, you look around in the group that you're in, and it seems like people aren't listening, there's probably a fair amount of I-it relating going on, and that is probably worth addressing. We want to practice inclusion and foster belongingness. Belongingness is that affiliative relationship that makes the I-thou way of relating possible. We want to practice peer-to-peer praise. This is like this is the opposite of what happens in most social media, right? Could we practice peer-to-peer praise, appreciating the mystery and dignity, the infinite worth of the people we're with? This is incredibly helpful to do. And it's so much different from the competitive way that we often relate with each other, the achievement orientation with which we relate to each other. And then the last thing I will say to you is that it's important that boundaries are the only thing that can bring us together. It's boundaries which are the loving respect for differentiated perspectives that bring us together. And we could say it, you can say this either way. You can say what keeps us together is what sets us apart, or what sets us apart is what keeps us together. The idea here really is that it's not possible to have connection without boundaries. And, some of you may know it's great poem by Robert Frost, The Mending Wall, and the tension that he describes there. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. And then, his neighbor's response to him is good fences make good neighbors. And there's a way that, of course, every fence connects us, right? And the wall between Frost and his neighbor actually connected them. So I think that's important for us to remember about boundaries.
We hope you found this podcast on boundaries helpful. You can tune into our full podcast series, Journey to Thrive, on our website at sjvcenter.org. Click on resources, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you, and God bless.